Our movie begins in the year 1945 on an island called Jersey, England. On this island, we see a very large and extremely luxurious mansion owned by a woman named Grace, who lives there with her two children, Anne and Nicholas. One day, Grace sends a letter to the newspaper asking them to publish an advertisement for hiring servants to work in the mansion. Indeed, we see three workers arriving at the mansion: Edmund, Pierce, and Lydia. Grace welcomes them, but is surprised at how quickly they came after the advertisement was published. She quickly begins explaining the rules and laws of the house and assigns their tasks. Edmund will be responsible for the garden, Lydia for cleaning, and Bertha for cooking and taking care of the children. The most important thing Grace asks of Lydia is not to make too much noise while working, because it gives her a headache quickly. Bertha then tells Grace not to worry about this at all, because Lydia is mute and doesn't speak. Then, Bertha asks Grace why such a large house has no servants at all. Grace replies that there were 3 servants before, but one night while they were sleeping, they all left together without any reason. They didn't even take their wages. After finishing her conversation with the servants, Grace asks them to close all the curtains in the house, and indeed they close them, and the place becomes very dark. At that moment, she takes them to the kitchen and says something very strange. We don't have electricity here, nor a radio, or any means of entertainment. Also, every door you enter or exit must be locked with a key, and don't forget that the curtains must remain closed at all times. She also tells them that she has breakfast at 7 o'clock, and the children have breakfast at 9 o'clock. Bertha then asks, "What about your husband? When does he have breakfast?" Grace replies, "Charles, my husband, left us to fight in France a year and a half ago, and honestly, I don't know anything about him since then. He didn't return after the war ended. I don't even know if he's alive or dead." After explaining everything, it's time for the servants to meet the children. Grace takes Bertha and Lydia to the children's room and brings them out to introduce them. The children meet the servants and are very happy. Grace then tells Lydia it's time for their breakfast. Prepare breakfast for them. After Lydia takes the children and leaves, Grace tells Bertha that her children have an extreme sensitivity to light. This sensitivity causes them ulcers, rashes, and even suffocation. However, they are allowed to live under the dim light of candles, which is why Grace keeps the curtains closed and the house dark at all times to ensure her children's safety. Later, we see Bertha in the kitchen with the children, preparing breakfast for them. Anne doesn't like the baked goods Bertha made and says someone else used to make them, so of course, they don't taste the same. Anne asks, "Are the servants not coming back?" Bertha says, "No, they're not coming back." Anne replies, "Right, they'll never come back after what happened that night." Bertha says, "What happened that night?" Anne replies, "That night, my mother completely lost her mind." At this point, Nicholas interrupts and tells her to stop lying, saying, "Nothing happened." But Bertha insists, "It did happen." From their conversation, we understand that something strange and wrong happened that night. Now, Grace enters the room upon hearing the children's voices and scolds them for being too loud. She then asks Bertha to follow her to discuss something. Bertha follows her, and Grace says, "I opened the mailbox and found the letter I sent to the newspaper still there. The advertisement hasn't even been published yet. Can you tell me how you knew I needed servants?" Bertha replies, "You didn't give me a chance to tell you the truth earlier. As soon as we arrived, I wanted to explain. We used to work in this mansion a long time ago, and we know it's a big place that requires a large number of servants to clean and maintain it. That's why we came here by chance to ask if you needed help. And honestly, I spent the most beautiful days of my life in this house." At this point, we notice that Grace starts to feel reassured again, and her anxiety and fear completely disappear. She says, "Okay, no problem. You can continue working as usual." After that, we see Grace sitting with the children, helping them study, and also teaching them a bit about religion to strengthen their faith. After finishing the study session, she decides to separate the children, Anne in one room and Nicholas in another, so each of them can read and memorize their lessons on their own. She also teaches them to be strong and not be afraid to be alone in any room. Grace does this, locks their doors with keys, and completely isolates them. Then she goes to the reception area, opens the curtains to let in some light, and breathes in some fresh air. But suddenly, Grace hears the sound of a child crying and imagines it's Nicholas. She rushes to check on him, but strangely, she finds Nicholas very calm. When she asks him, "Were you crying?" he replies, "No, I wasn't crying, Mum." Grace then thinks it might have been Anne, so she quickly runs to her room and asks, "Were you crying, my dear?" Anne replies, "No, I wasn't crying, Mum. It was Victor who was crying." Grace asks, "Victor? Who's Victor, sweetheart?" Anne says, "Victor is the little boy. I always see him crying because he's scared of this house and wants to leave, but his family refuses to let him go." At this moment, Grace is on the verge of losing her composure. She's shocked by Anne's imaginary story and asks her confidently, "How did this boy Victor get in?" "I locked the door with a key." Anne replies, "He came through the other door." When Grace looks at the door, she finds it open. She becomes extremely angry, gathers the servants, and scolds them harshly for being negligent and leaving the door unlocked. The problem is, they all insist that none of them even went near that room. Grace is almost driven mad because she's sure she locked the door herself, but the matter passes and things calm down. Later, we see the children in their room, preparing for bed, but Anne sees Victor, the invisible boy, in the room and quickly moves away from him. Nicholas doesn't believe Anne's story and thinks she's just trying to scare him. At that moment, Anne starts talking to Victor, and Victor responds. Nicholas hears Victor's voice, but Anne is actually changing her voice to scare him, nothing more. Nicholas threatens to call his mother and tell her what Anne is doing. Anne, however, is determined to prove to Nicholas that she's not joking and asks Victor to touch Nicholas's cheek. Victor does so, and Nicholas starts screaming in fear. Grace hears his screams and asks, "What happened?" Nicholas says she's changing her voice and doing scary, strange things to frighten. Grace becomes very angry with Anne and says, "I'm fed up with you and your actions, honestly." After a while, Grace takes Anne to a room alone and asks her to apologize for her wrong behavior, but Anne refuses to apologize, saying, "I didn't do anything wrong to apologize for in the first place." As punishment, Grace makes Anne sit and study on the stairs all night without any break. As for Grace, she's sitting in a room, knitting with Bertha by her side. Grace asks Bertha to go and tell Lydia not to make too much noise while cleaning, because the sounds are giving her a headache. She also tells Bertha to ask Lydia to move quietly, because Grace feels like there are 3 people moving around her at the same time, as if they're circling her. Bertha reassures her, saying, "It's just the 2 of us, Mom," and then leaves to go to the garden to relay the instructions to Lydia. Strangely, Grace hears footsteps coming from the ceiling and feels the chandelier shaking, even though she can clearly see Bertha and Lydia outside the house. At the same moment, she hears strange noises inside the house. Quickly, she goes to Anne and asks if she heard the noises too. Anne replies, "I've been telling you from the beginning that I see strange people and strange things, but you don't believe me." Grace asks, "Where are they now?" Anne says, "In the storage room." Grace gathers herself and enters the storage room, where she hears the voices very clearly, 2 women and a child, very close to her. Grace is terrified and starts searching the room thoroughly, but finds no one. She quickly exits the room and asks Anne, "Did you see them again?" Anne replies, "Yes, they left the room and went downstairs. I heard them saying that this is their house and they want to kick us out. They also want to remove the curtains from the windows." At this point, Grace loses her temper, convinced that these are just thieves who have entered the house to rob it. That's all she can think of right now. After this, Grace gathers Bertha and the children in a room and starts expressing her anger about what's happening. She says, "I've lived here for 5 years, and nothing like this has ever happened to me before." And then says, "Come and look at this. I've drawn the family I always see." The drawing includes a man, a woman, the child Victor, and an old woman who looks very scary. We also notice that Anne has written numbers next to each figure. Grace asks, "What are these numbers?" Anne replies, "That's how many times I've seen each of them. The one who has appeared the most is the scary old woman." Grace is shocked and becomes very afraid for the children. She quickly asks the servants to search the house inch by inch to catch these so-called thieves. The servants go off to search for the thieves, while Grace takes a rifle and starts searching every corner of the house herself. She enters a room filled with old belongings of the previous residents. While searching through these items, she finds some photos. The strange thing is that in all the photos, the people have their eyes closed and appear to be sleeping. At that moment, Bertha enters and says, "We've searched everywhere and found nothing." Grace, however, isn't paying attention to her. Her focus is entirely on the photos. Curiosity makes her ask Bertha, "Why are these people sleeping in the photos?" The shocking revelation is that Bertha replies, "They're not sleeping, ma'am. They're dead." She explains that this is an old tradition from the last century, where people would photograph their deceased loved ones, believing that their spirits could return and reside within the photos. Grace asks, "How could people believe in such strange superstitions?" Bertha replies, "When someone you love deeply dies, the grief can make you lose your mind completely." Now we see Grace sitting and chatting with Bertha for a while. Grace asks her, "Why did the previous owners of the mansion, the ones you used to work for, leave the house?" Bertha replies, "They moved their lives to London because of work circumstances and left us, the servants, here to take care of and clean the mansion. But after a while, we also left the mansion because a disease called tuberculosis spread across the entire island. and the residents had to evacuate. I left because I missed this place so much, which is why I came back here as soon as I could. After they finish talking, Bertha goes to sleep because it's late, and Grace also heads to her room to sleep. But suddenly, Grace hears someone playing the piano. Overcome with fear, she grabs her rifle and goes to the music room to see who's there. Strangely, she finds no one. She quickly covers the piano and leaves the room. At that moment, the door slams shut on its own, and Grace hears the sound of a key turning. She starts reading about the underworld, demons and such things, believing that the world of the dead sometimes overlaps with the world of the living. Grace says, "I never believed in these superstitions before, but it seems they're real." Quickly, she decides to go to the town to meet the church priest and ask him to purify the house of evil spirits. Before leaving, she goes to Edmund and tells him, "When my husband bought the mansion, they told him there are graves of the previous owners in the garden. I want you to search for these graves and see if there's a child named Victor among them." After she leaves through the gate, we see Bertha standing next to Edmund, giving Grace a strange look. Edmund says, "Are we just going to let her go like this?" No, things are getting out of hand. Do you think she'll believe us now?" Bertha replies, No, we'll wait a bit. Everything will happen in its own time." She then asks him to cover the graves with leaves very carefully. Here we understand that the servants know the truth about what's happening in the house and are hiding it from Grace. Why are they hiding it, and what's the reason? We'll find out, but not right now. Meanwhile, Grace is walking through the forest, and the fog is so thick that it completely obscures her vision. Suddenly, her husband Charles appears out of nowhere. He looks exhausted and worn out from the war. Grace can't believe her eyes. Charles has finally returned. She forgets about the priest, the evil spirits, Victor, and all that talk. She takes Charles and returns to the house. When the children see him, they're overjoyed. Charles is also very happy to see them, but since he's tired, he goes to sleep immediately and can't join them for dinner, unfortunately. During dinner, Nicholas asks Grace, "Was Dad fighting with the bad guys or the good guys?" Grace replies, "He was defending his land, so he was fighting with the good guys, of course." Nicholas says, "I'm scared of wars and killing." Grace reassures him, No, don't be afraid. You'll stay safe at home with your mom and sister." And then says, "What about the ghosts living with us? Are we safe here, or are you just joking with us?" Grace, annoyed, replies, "Don't talk about things that aren't your concern." At this point, Anne leaves the table in tears. Bertha follows her and says, "I've seen the ghosts too, just like you." Anne asks, "Really? Why don't you tell Mom? Maybe she'll believe you." Bertha replies, "She'll believe it eventually, whether she wants to or not. And over time, everything will change." Here we notice that Bertha's words carry a big mystery, which will be revealed later, especially when Grace starts to believe in what's happening. Later, we see Grace taking Anne to a room and dressing her in a white dress and veil that Grace embroidered herself as a way of making peace with her. Since the dress is white, Grace warns Anne not to sit on the floor to avoid getting it dirty. Afterward, Grace leaves the room to check on Charles. When she returns, she finds Anne sitting on the floor. Grace scolds her for not listening, but the shock comes when she realizes that the person sitting on the floor is actually the scary old woman Anne had drawn earlier. The strange thing is that when the old woman speaks, her voice is exactly like Anne's. Grace breaks down, loses her composure, and starts hitting the old woman, shouting, "Where did you take my daughter?" But quickly, we discover that the person Grace is hitting is actually Anne herself. Anne screams in fear, terrified of her mother. At that moment, Bertha takes Anne and leaves the room to calm her down. After a while, Grace goes to her room and Charles tells her, "You told me everything." Grace replies, "I wasn't hitting her. I was hitting the scary old woman." Charles says, "No, you told me what happened. Why did the servants leave the house?" Grace insists, "That's a lie. None of what I told you actually happened." Now, we finally understand that everything happening in the mansion started after that night, but we still don't know exactly what happened that night. At that time, Charles informs Grace that he has to return to the war. Grace is devastated and begs him not to leave them alone again. She starts screaming and crying, but Charles calms her down with a few words and leaves. The next morning, Grace wakes up and finds Charles gone. She rushes to the gate and realizes he has left them to return to the war. At the same time, she hears the children screaming and runs to see what's wrong. When she enters their room, she finds that the curtains have disappeared, and the light is reaching the children, making them afraid of getting sick. They continue screaming, but Grace quickly takes them out of the room. To her shock, she discovers that all the curtains in the house have vanished. She moves from room to room until she reaches a somewhat dark room. She checks the children's bodies and faces to see if they've been affected, but to her surprise, they're perfectly fine. Anne, scared, asks where her father went. Grace tells her he went back to the war, and Anne is heartbroken, refusing to believe he left. But unfortunately, that's the truth. Grace, furious, gathers the servants and asks who removed the curtains. They calmly reply, "We don't know." "Are you going to hide your family in the dark forever? How will you know if they've recovered from the disease if you keep them hidden like this?" Grace is deeply upset by their tone and ends up kicking all the servants out of the house. As they leave, she overhears Edmund telling Bertha, "We need to show her the graves in the garden so she can finally understand." Grace begins searching the house room by room, trying to figure out what's happening. Later that night, she decides to escape the house to search for her husband. Nicholas, who we know is usually cowardly, gathers his courage and runs away with Anne to search for their father. They start moving through the garden until they reach the graves. The shock is that they find the names of the servants, Edmund, Lydia, and Bertha, on the graves. They realize that the servants are actually dead and were likely the original owners of the mansion. Meanwhile, Grace enters Bertha and Lydia's room and finds a photo of the three servants with their eyes closed, confirming they're dead. At that moment, she hears her children screaming and runs to save them. She tells the children to go inside the house quickly while she confronts the servants. She starts shooting at them, but they calmly say, "We're already dead. We died of tuberculosis over 50 years ago." Thea takes over Grace, and she runs inside the house, locking the door behind her. The children are sitting on the stairs, terrified. Grace hugs them and tells them to go upstairs and lock themselves in. The servants stand outside the door, begging Grace to let them in, saying, "We want to save you and your children." Grace yells, "Save us from whom? You're the ghosts. You're the problem. Who are you saving us from?" They reply, "No, it's not us. It's the living who are trying to harm you. They've removed the curtains to force you out of the house." At the same time, we see the children hiding in a closet, terrified. To make matters worse, the scary old woman opens the closet door and the children scream in fear. Grace hears their screams and rushes upstairs. Bertha tells her the living are upstairs. Go save her children from them. Grace opens the door to the room and finds the old woman sitting with two men and a woman, conducting a ritual to cleanse the house of spirits and demons. The old woman asks Anne to tell her what happened. Nicholas tells Anne not to say anything, but Anne insists, "I'll tell her so she can leave us alone." Anne approaches the old woman and reveals the truth about what happened that night. Finally, we learn the truth. After Charles disappeared, Grace went through severe psychological distress. On that night, Grace lost her mind and smothered her children with a pillow, killing them. When she regained her senses, she realized the horror of what she had done and shot herself. We now understand that Grace and her children are also dead. Their spirits are the ones haunting the house, disturbing the new residents. That's why the living call the old woman to cleanse the house. The old woman communicates with their spirits and learns their story from Anne, who confesses what happened. However, the children don't realize they're dead. They think it was just an accident and continue to imagine themselves as alive. Grace has also repressed the memory of the incident and continues to live in the house as if nothing happened. When the old woman asks Anne, "Why are you still living in this house even though you were dead?" Grace and the children are shocked. They insist, "We're not dead. What are you talking about?" Grace attacks the old woman, tearing the paper she was writing on. Everyone in the room sees the paper being torn, but doesn't see Grace because she's just a spirit without a physical form. After this, the wife of the house's owner says, "We need to leave this place immediately. Things have gotten out of control. If you had believed Victor when he said he saw a little girl, none of this would have happened." It turns out Victor is the only living person in the house, and he's the one who's been afraid of the spirits all along. The man agrees with his wife and says, "We'll leave tomorrow morning." After the session ends, Bertha enters the house and comforts Grace, saying, "Now that you know the truth, try to coexist with the living without causing trouble. As long as this house stands, new people will move in and will continue to live here too." Anne asks, "Is my father dead too, or is he still alive?" Grace replies, "Since he came to visit us, it means he's dead. What came to us was his spirit." Finally, we see the family that currently lives in the mansion packing their belongings and leaving. They write for sale on the gate and the story ends. This was our movie for today. If you enjoyed it, please like and subscribe for more videos like this. See you next time.